I remember when I first started doing photography, one of my big first struggle when it comes to buying camera gear was to pick my first telephoto lens. I was like deciding between whether I should get a 70-200 2.8 or the 70-200 f4 lens. The f2.8 has the faster aperture, it's better for low light, it also have a shallow depth of field, so it's easier to separate the foreground from the background. It's pretty much like the ultimate telephoto lens that a lot of people would want to have. But on the other hand, the 70-200 f4, it's just a lot more affordable, it's much smaller and also lighter, so the chance of bringing it with me after I bought it would also be a lot higher. I think this is a struggle that a lot of people would also encounter. But what about if there's a lens that has the best of both worlds? And today we are looking at exactly that lens, which is the Tamron 70-180 f2.8 lens for the Sony E-mount system. So let's have a look if it's really the best of both worlds or it's too good to be true. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we are going to have a look at the Tamron 70-180 f2.8 lens for the Sony E-mount mirrorless cameras. This lens, there are two things that make it very interesting. The first one is that it is a very compact lens. This is a f2.8 lens, but if you put it side by side with the two Sony 70-200 lens here, you can see it is not only significantly smaller than the 70-200 f2.8 G Master lens, it is also smaller and quite a bit smaller than the 70-200 f4 lens, even though it is a f2.8 lens. And not only that, the weight of the lens is also quite a bit lighter than the f2.8. In fact, it is pretty much like half the weight of the f2.8 G Master, and it is very similar to the Sony f4 lens. So the small size and weight made the Tamron a very attractive choice for someone who wants to have a fast lens but don't want to carry a very heavy camera bag. And the second thing that is also very interesting is the price of the lens. Now the price is probably a bit dependent on different country, but here in New Zealand the price of the Tamron lens is pretty much like half the price of the f2.8 G Master lens, and it is very similar to the Sony 70-200 f4 lens. So this also make it a very attractive choice for people who don't really want to spend a lot of money but still want to have the f2.8 fast aperture. On paper, it seems the only biggest downside with the Tamron is that it is only up to 180mm while the two Sony is up to 200mm, but we will look at that, have a look at the difference a little bit later on in this review. Before we start, I just want to say a big thank you to the guys at the Auckland Camera Center for supplying the two Sony lenses for me to work on this comparison review. With all these three lenses sitting side by side, I think the first thing I noticed is definitely the size of the Tamron is quite a bit smaller than the two Sony lenses. And then I do notice the Tamron is also feeling quite a bit more plasticky compared to the two Sony. The two Sony feel very metalish, very solid, while the Tamron in comparison definitely is a bit more plastic. But despite that, the overall build quality of the Tamron is still pretty decent. Everything seems to fit together very nicely. The focus ring, the zoom ring, everything feel pretty nice, and there is a lock switch here which is pretty large and it feels very nice when you try to lock the zoom ring. And unlike the Sigma 2470 that I just reviewed recently, when you lock the lens, it is really locked, unlike the Sigma, which you can actually put a bit of force and unlock it. The two Sony lenses does have a few extra features. For example, it has the built-in tripod collar, which is also removable, and it feels very solid, and it also has the optical image stabilizer, which is it used to be very important thing for a telephoto lens, because back then most cameras they do not have the in-body image stabilizer, but these days most cameras would have the in-body image stabilizer. So having the optical image stabilizer is definitely nice and still can help improve the optical stabilization, but it's not quite as important when the camera already has the in-body image stabilizer. And on the two Sony lenses, it also has the additional switches for you to switch between autofocus, manual focus mode, the turn on or turn off the optical image stabilization, and also the different image stabilization mode, and also the focus limiter. So these are the things that are missing on the Tamron lens. And another thing that is different between the Tamron and the two Sony is the Tamron, while it is an internal focus lens, but when you change the focal length, the lens would extend, while the two Sony lens, it wouldn't change the overall length, no matter you are changing the focus or you are changing the focal length. So overall, the two Sony lenses definitely have a stronger and more solid build quality than the Tamron, and also has more feature, but consider the Tamron is quite a bit cheaper. I think most people would be quite happy to accept the difference. The Tamron's autofocus performance is very smooth and pretty quiet. In terms of the autofocus speed, the Tamron is fast, but it's not as fast as the two Sony, especially the 2.8 Sony, which is very fast. But having said that, using the Tamron to shoot moving object is still not really a problem. Have a look at this set of photos that I shot using the A7R4 with my boy running towards me at close distance. The Tamron can handle it pretty easily. However, I noticed with the Tamron lens, if I stop down the aperture to around FA, and then when I take a photo just using the shutter button, it appears like when you look at the viewfinder or the LCD screen, the picture is slightly out of focus, but when I check the photo that it captured, it is actually in focus. None of the Sony lenses would have this kind of behavior. And when shooting video in continuous autofocus mode, the overall performance is still pretty nice. The transition is quite smooth. I do have a little bit of reliability problem, but I think that's more to do with the camera setting that I use rather than the lens itself. And if you are a Nikon shooter, I have also tried the Tamron lens on a Nikon Z6 using the Tekka adapter. The Nikon Z6 is using the latest 3.0 firmware, and also the Tekka adapter is using the latest firmware. And I am pretty happy with the results. When I'm shooting photos using the single point autofocus, the autofocus speed is very fast and also seems to be pretty reliable. Switch to the eye or face detection when taking portrait photos, the result is still pretty reliable. And we also try to shoot some video using continuous autofocus and face detection, and just handheld the camera and shooting at the maximum aperture. The result is still pretty good. The transition seems to be pretty smooth. Now, I still wouldn't call it perfect because from time to time the autofocus would kind of like lock up or jump quite a bit, but with a lens that is just adapt on another body using a third-party adapter, I have to say I'm really impressed with the result that I saw. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the biggest downside of the Tamron is definitely the maximum focal length is only 180mm compared to the 200mm with the two Sonys. So here is a side-by-side photo, just let you see the actual difference between what you can capture at 180mm compared to 200mm. The difference is definitely noticeable, but because our cameras are so high resolution these days, I think for most people you'll be happy to, if you really want the extra zoom, you can just crop your photo a little bit and you can get a very similar result. Okay, now let's talk about the image quality, and as usual, let's start with the image sharpness first. So have a look at the result I got at 70mm. All these photos were shot using a Sony A7R4, so that's a 61 megapixel high resolution camera. And if you look at the center of the photo, the Tamron at f2.8, even with the A7R4, even if you look at the 200% zoom, the center sharpness is already very good. If you compare it to the Sony 70-200 f2.8, I think the overall is very similar. I would say the Tamron may have slightly better contrast. When stopped down to f4, the two f2.8 lenses, the center sharpness is very similar, while the 70-200 f4 lens is noticeably not as sharp as the two 2.8 lenses. Stop down the Tamron to f5.6, the center sharpness doesn't seem to get any better. Okay, now let's look at the corner sharpness at 70mm. I think this time the Sony 2.8 lens is slightly sharper than the Tamron, but even when I'm looking at them at 200% zoom, the difference is still very small. When stopped down to f4, this time the Tamron seems to be slightly sharper than the Sony, but again, the difference is very minor, and the Sony 70-200 f4 lens definitely resolve quite a bit less detail compared to the two other lenses. For the Tamron lens, it seems the corners are the sharpest at f5.6. Next, let's look at the image sharpness at the telephoto end. Now, because the Tamron lens is a little bit shorter focal length compared to the two other lenses, so all the sample I shot with the Tamron lens, I moved the camera slightly forward to allow me to compare the sharpness a little bit easier. Okay, let's look at this photo captured at f2.8 at the maximum focal length. I think the center sharpness is very similar between these two lenses. Maybe the Sony is a little bit sharper. And when stopped down to f4, I think again the center sharpness of these two lenses are very similar. And with the f4 lens, I think once again it is a little bit softer. Okay, now let's look at the corner sharpness at f2.8. This time the Tamron seems to be quite a bit sharper than the Sony at the maximum aperture. Even when we stop down to f4, the Tamron is still quite a bit sharper than the Sony. I may even say that the Tamron at f2.8 is still sharper than the Sony 2.8 lens at f4. And the Sony 70-200 f4 lens is definitely the softest when it comes to the corner sharpness. It is noticeably softer than the two other lenses at the same aperture setting. When we stop down to f5.6, the Tamron is pretty sharp even at the corner, and the two other Sony lenses cannot get to that kind of sharpness no matter what aperture value I choose. Okay, next let's have a look at the distortion. At 70mm, both the Tamron and the Sony f4 lens, there is a small amount of distortion, while the Sony f2.8 lens definitely has more noticeable distortion. At 135mm focal length, this time it's the Tamron that has a little bit of pincushion distortion, while the Sony 2.8 lens has virtually no distortion. At the maximum focal length, all three lenses has a bit of pincushion distortion, but the Tamron lens does have a little bit more distortion than the two other lenses. In terms of vignetting, at the wide end 70mm, the Tamron does have some noticeable vignetting at the maximum aperture f2.8. When you stop down to f4, then most of the vignetting would have disappeared. Compared it with the two Sony lenses, at 70mm, the Tamron does have the best vignetting control, while the Sony 70-200 f4 lens has the most noticeable vignetting. At the telephoto end, with the Tamron lens, there is some noticeable vignetting at the maximum aperture f2.8. Stop down to f4 would remove most of the vignetting, but you do have to stop down to f5.6 if you don't want to have any noticeable vignetting. Compared to the Sonys at the telephoto end, I think the vignetting of the Tamron is very similar to the Sony f2.8 lens, while the f4 Sony does have more noticeable vignetting at the same aperture value. With the long focal length and the fast aperture, especially the two f2.8 lenses, it's quite easy to create image with shallow depth of field, so a lot of people would be looking at buying one of these lenses to shoot some portrait because you can turn the background into bokeh. But in terms of the actual bokeh quality, I would say the bokeh quality from all these three lenses are okay. Definitely I wouldn't call it a bokeh monster, because I can see quite a bit of bokeh fringing from the photo that I shot with all these three lenses, and also the bokeh itself is probably not perfectly smooth. So overall the bokeh is okay, but if you want the best bokeh quality, probably you should still get a portrait lens. All these three lenses have very good lens flare control and very minimal amount of ghosting. Even when I'm shooting directly into the sun, I don't see too much lens flare or ghosting. But between the three lenses, it seems the Tamron does have the least amount of lens flare and ghosting. When it comes to chromatic aberration, I think once again, all these three lenses have very good chromatic aberration control. Even when shooting some high contrast scene and with the very demanding A7R4, I see very little amount of color fringing even at the high contrast area. So definitely very good CA control for all these three lenses. If you are a filmmaker and looking at picking up one of these lenses to do a bit of video shooting, the Tamron and the Sony f4 lens both have very minimal amount of focus breathing, while the Sony f2.8 lens does have more noticeable focus breathing. Before I pick up this Tamron 70-180 2.8 lens to do this review, I know that the Tamron is like half the price, half the weight of the Sony 2.8, and also quite a bit smaller. So I was expecting the Tamron is probably good value for money because it's half the price, but overall it's probably not going to be as good as the Sony. But after doing all this comparison and using them side by side, I'm very surprised by the result. The Sony lenses does definitely have better build quality. They feel quite a bit more solid, and they also have more feature like the image stabilization. It has the built-in tripod collar, so the Tamron definitely feel more plasticky. But apart from that, if you just look at the image quality, the Tamron is pretty much just as good as the Sony. Image sharpness, which I know is what a lot of you guys cared about the most, the Tamron is just as good as the Sony 2.8 lens, if not slightly better. And if you look at all the other things, for example, the vignetting, the chromatic aberration, lens flare, distortion, focus breathing, the Tamron is overall just at least as good as the Sony, which is really surprising. The other biggest difference is, of course, the Tamron is only 180mm while the Sony is 200mm. But for a lens that is half the price, half the weight, and a lot smaller, I think the Tamron is not just better value for money, but it could actually be the better lens than the Sony, unless you do want the more solid build quality and probably the more professional design that the Sony 2.8 lens can offer. And if you compare the Tamron with the Sony 70-200 f4 lens, these two lenses are very similar in a lot of ways. In terms of the price, the size, and the weight, actually the Tamron is a little bit smaller than the Sony. But while the Sony has better build quality, the image quality from the Tamron is actually better than the Sony. So to me, if I have to pick between these two lenses, I would definitely pick the Tamron, as it is also one stop faster. Thank you very much for watching this video. I'm also quite interested to hear about your opinion about these three lenses. Which is the lens that you would buy of these three? And if you have any questions about these lenses, please just feel free to ask me. Thanks again for watching this video, and I will see you in my next video.